The alarm on my desk screamed before I even opened my eyes that morning, and I knew, somehow, that the vote had already happened without me. My name is Ves Corin, and for 11 years I served as chief observer for the Concord Assembly, the body that ruled over 400 worlds and called itself the voice of order in this galaxy. I had watched empires rise. I had watched empires fall. I had never, not once, watched a single species walk away from a fight it could have won, until the humans did. Let me take you back to the hour it started, because you need to understand how wrong we all were, and how long it took us to understand just how wrong. The Grand Hall of the Concord sat at the center of a station called Meridian Spire, a ring of dark metal wrapped around a dying star that we had kept alive with old technology none of us fully understood anymore. Delegates from 60 species filled the chamber that day, wings and scales and too many eyes blinking under artificial light, all of them waiting for the same thing. They were waiting to hear humanity break. For 3 years, the Concord had pressed humanity to accept oversight. Every human colony, every human fleet, every human decision would need approval from a council that did not include a single human voice. They called it protection. They called it structure. I called it what it was even then, though I never said it aloud, a leash. Humanity had refused every offer, every threat, every quiet warning delivered through back channels. So the assembly voted, and the vote was almost unanimous. Humanity would submit to Concord law, or humanity would leave known space entirely, taking nothing that belonged to the Concord and touching nothing that belonged to the Concord ever again. I remember thinking it was a formality. I remember thinking they would ask for more time, offer a compromise, send another envoy to argue for another year. Species always did. Nobody walks away from 400 worlds of trade routes, shared technology, and protection from raiders. Nobody walks away from everything they built. The human ambassador stood when his name was called. His name was Daniel Whitfield, and I had spoken with him twice before during trade disputes. He was younger than most delegates, with tired eyes and a voice that never rose no matter how loud the chamber got around him. He did not argue. He did not ask for time. He looked at the assembly, and he said something I still remember word for word, because it was so short and so calm that the translators almost missed it. He said, "We accept your terms. We will leave." The chamber went silent in a way I had never heard before. Delegates who had spent 3 years preparing counter-arguments suddenly had nothing to say. I watched the chief speaker, a tall being named Oren Vashta, from a species that prided itself on reading emotion through scent, actually lean forward and sniff the air near the human delegation, as if searching for the fear that should have been there. There was no fear. There was something else instead, something none of us had a word for yet. I was assigned that same week to lead the observation team monitoring the withdrawal. It sounded like an easy post. Watch the humans pack up, confirm they left nothing behind, file a report, move on to the next crisis. My superiors treated it as a reward, a quiet posting before retirement. I took the assignment without complaint, thinking I would spend a few months cataloging empty buildings and shutting down old comm relays. I arrived at the human colony of Ashgate Station 3 days later, expecting chaos. I expected panic in the corridors, families arguing over what they could take, officials scrambling to organize ships that were never designed for a mass exodus. That is what happens when a species loses everything at once. I had seen it before, on other worlds, during other collapses. What I found instead was silence, and the silence was worse than any panic could have been. Ashgate Station ran with the precision of a machine that had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Families moved through the corridors in ordered lines, each group led by someone with a datapad and a checklist. Cargo bays loaded ships in careful sequence, largest first, smallest last, nothing wasted, nothing left to chance. Children were not crying, adults were not shouting, everyone simply worked, quiet and steady, like a colony of insects that had received the same silent signal at the same silent moment. I found a young woman named Claire Bennett supervising one of the loading docks, and I asked her, through my translator, how long they had been preparing for this. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Long enough," she said, and went back to her checklist. That answer stayed with me longer than it should have. I had assumed, like every other delegate in that chamber, that the vote to exile humanity was a punishment we handed down. Watching Ashgate Station empty itself with the calm of a fire drill, I began to wonder if the punishment had been expected, planned for, perhaps even wanted. I spent the next 2 weeks moving between human colonies, and the pattern never broke. Every world emptied in the same disciplined silence. Ships that should have taken months to organize launched on schedule, down to the hour. Engineers dismantled equipment that belonged to the Concord and left it in neat, labeled piles for collection, while everything that belonged to humanity, every last tool and record and seed bank, disappeared onto transport vessels built for exactly this purpose. I asked myself the question that would follow me for years afterward. When do you build ships for an exodus you have not yet been ordered to make? On my 9th day at Ashgate, I met a man named Henry Voss, a pilot in his 30s who flew supply runs between the departing fleets. He had a habit of talking while he worked, the way some people do when silence makes them uneasy, and from him I learned things that no official report would ever contain. He told me about drills. Not military exercises exactly, but community exercises, where entire towns would practice packing everything they owned within a set number of hours, competing against their own best times like it was a sport. He told me children were taught the routes to the launch bays before they were taught to read a star chart. He told me, almost as an afterthought, that his grandmother used to say the Concord would ask them to leave someday, and that the only mistake would be being unprepared when it happened. I asked him if he was afraid of what waited beyond Concord space. He laughed, not unkindly, and said the thing that unsettled me most of all. He said the only thing that scared him was staying. I filed my first report to the assembly that night, and I wrote it as carefully as I could, because I did not know yet how to explain a feeling instead of a fact. I wrote that the withdrawal was proceeding without incident. I wrote that humanity showed no signs of distress. I did not write the sentence that kept forming in my mind, over and over, because I knew how it would sound to delegates who wanted only good news. I did not write that we had not defeated humanity. I did not write that we had simply given them permission to do what they had always intended to do. By the end of the 3rd week, the last human ships crossed the border marker that the Concord had drawn along the edge of known space, a line none of our fleets were permitted to cross without formal invitation. I stood on the observation deck of my own vessel and watched the final convoy pass through the marker, hundreds of ships moving in careful formation, lights dimmed, engines quiet, disappearing into the dark beyond our maps. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated a victory that felt less like a victory with every passing hour. I remember Oren Vashta standing beside me on that deck, saying nothing for a long time before finally speaking in a voice much quieter than the one he used in the Grand Hall. He said, "Why do I feel like we just opened a door instead of closing one?" I did not have an answer for him that night. I would not have an answer for years. But I remember the last thing I saw before the human convoy vanished from our sensors entirely. It was a single small ship, lagging slightly behind the others, and on its hull, painted in simple human letters, was a message clearly meant for anyone still watching from Concord space. It said, "We will remember this." I did not know then whether to read it as a threat or a promise. I know now that it was both, and that the galaxy would spend the coming years learning exactly what humanity meant by those 4 words, in ways none of us in that chamber could have imagined when we thought we were watching a species walk away in defeat. 3 years passed before I understood the true size of what we had lost, and I only understood it because I was ordered back into the field to make sense of numbers that no longer made sense to anyone at Meridian Spire. After the human exodus, the Concord Assembly did what every large, comfortable institution does after removing its greatest source of friction. It relaxed. Trade routes that had once required careful balancing between human interests and Concord interests suddenly flowed without argument. Military budgets that had been justified by the need to match human shipbuilding were quietly reduced, year after year, as delegates congratulated themselves on a peace dividend that felt, to them, like a reward for good governance. I was not so comfortable. My new assignment was border monitoring, a dull posting compared to the drama of the withdrawal, but it placed me at listening stations along the edge of what used to be shared space. My task was simple: watch the line humanity had crossed, report anything unusual. For the first year, there was nothing to report at all, and that nothing began to worry me more than any incident could have. Humanity had not simply left, humanity had vanished. No signals crossed the border. No trade ships approached, not even the smugglers who once tried their luck moving goods between human colonies and Concord markets. No diplomatic messages arrived requesting reconsideration. No distress calls asking for aid. Nothing at all that suggested a species adjusting to sudden exile in unfamiliar territory. It was as if humanity had sealed a door behind itself and simply stopped existing from our point of view. I raised this concern in my quarterly reports, and each time, my superiors read it as good news. No contact meant no conflict. No conflict meant no cost. A junior officer named Petra Solvin, who reviewed my files before they reached the assembly, told me once, over a shared meal, that I was the only observer in the sector who seemed unhappy that a problem had solved itself. I told her that problems do not solve themselves. They only go quiet before they return larger than before. She laughed at the time. She did not laugh later. During those years I kept a private log, separate from my official reports, because I needed somewhere to record the things that would not fit neatly into assembly language. I wrote about the drills at Ashgate Station. I wrote about Henry Voss and his casual mention of grandmothers preparing for exile as if it were inevitable. I wrote about the message painted on the hull of that last departing ship, and I wrote, more than once, a simple question I could not shake. What does a species do with itself when it stops asking anyone else for permission? I found part of my answer through an old contact, a trader named Pharaoh Idrisi who ran a small independent fleet along routes that technically belonged to no one, since the Concord's authority thinned out the further you traveled from the central worlds. Pharaoh had no love for the Concord and no particular loyalty to humanity either, which made him one of the few sources I trusted completely. He told me things during our meetings that never appeared in any official record, because officially, he had never crossed the human border at all. According to Pharaoh, human space had not shrunk after the Exodus. It had grown, quietly and steadily, in directions the Concord had never bothered to map because we assumed nothing worth finding existed there. Humanity had spent decades before the exile scouting systems beyond our maps, and once free of Concord oversight, they simply moved into territory they had already claimed in secret, systems with resources the Concord had never even catalogued. Pharaoh described colonies built with a speed that should not have been possible, populations that grew faster than any natural rate should allow, and shipyards that produced vessels unlike anything humanity had flown while still part of the Concord. He told me humans did not look like refugees when he encountered them at the edges of their territory. He said they looked like people who had finally been allowed to stop pretending to be smaller than they were. I asked him why he thought the Concord had never noticed any of this. His answer was simple, and it has stayed with me since. He said the Concord never looked, because the Concord assumed a species could not thrive without permission. He said humanity proved that assumption wrong before the ink on the exile order had even dried. Meanwhile, back at Meridian Spire, cracks were forming in the peace everyone insisted on celebrating. Pirate fleets that had once avoided Concord shipping lanes out of fear grew bolder, striking convoys along routes that used to be heavily defended by joint patrols involving human ships. Without humanity's aggressive border enforcement, smaller predatory species began testing the edges of Concord territory, probing for weaknesses the way animals test a fence they suspect is no longer charged. A minor warlord named Dresh Kalor, leader of a splinter faction from a species called the Ordoon, launched a series of raids against outer colonies that the Concord had always assumed were safe under the old arrangement. I remember the assembly debating for weeks over how to respond, arguing over budgets and jurisdiction while colonists died waiting for a decision. Under the old system, human fleets would have responded within hours, not out of loyalty to the colonies, but because instability anywhere threatened trade everywhere, and humanity had always treated instability as a problem to be solved quickly and directly. Without that response, Thresher grew more confident with each passing month. The Assembly finally organized a joint fleet to push him back, but it took nearly a full season to assemble, coordinate, and deploy a force that, in the old days, would have been organized within a week. I watched MeantHFY age visibly during those debates, the confidence he once carried in the Grand Hall replaced by something closer to quiet dread. I began compiling everything I had learned into a single report, the one nobody wanted to read. I titled it plainly, The Cost of an Empty Border. In it, I laid out the pattern as clearly as I could. Trade stability during the human era had never come only from agreements and treaties. It had come from the simple fact that no predator wanted to test a species capable of responding to any threat with overwhelming speed and unpredictable force. Humanity had been, without anyone in the Assembly ever admitting it aloud, the reason so many smaller conflicts never escalated into larger ones. I submitted the report through official channels, and for a long time, I heard nothing back. When the response finally came, it was not from the Assembly floor, but from a private message sent by MeantHFY himself, requesting a meeting in a location he chose, specifically because it had no recording devices. We met in a small garden module near the edge of Meridian Spire, one of the few quiet places left on a station that had grown steadily louder and more chaotic as border incidents multiplied. MeantHFY looked older than I remembered, his usual confidence replaced by something heavier. He asked me directly if I believed humanity had planned their own exile from the beginning. I told him what I had come to believe after years of watching the border and listening to traitors like Pharaoh Idrisi. I told him I no longer thought the Concord had ever truly controlled the outcome of that vote. I told him that humanity had simply allowed us to believe we held the power to remove them, when in truth they had been waiting for an excuse to remove themselves. He asked me what that meant for the Concord now, with pirates growing bolder and warlords testing borders that used to be unshakable. I told him the truth as plainly as I could. It meant we had spent years congratulating ourselves for solving a problem, when all we had actually done was remove the only force strong enough to keep smaller problems from becoming larger ones. He sat with that for a long time before speaking again. When he finally did, his voice had none of the authority I remembered from the Grand Hall. He simply asked, quietly, whether I thought humanity would ever answer if the Concord asked for help. I told him I did not know. I told him that if humanity had spent generations preparing for exile, they had likely also spent that time deciding exactly what kind of relationship they wanted with the Concord afterward, and that decision belonged entirely to them now. We were no longer the ones setting the terms. We had not been for a very long time. We had simply been too comfortable to notice. That conversation in the garden module marked the last calm moment I remember, before everything at Meridian Spire began to unravel, far faster than any of us were prepared for. The attack came without warning, and it came from a direction none of us had ever bothered to defend. I had returned to Meridian Spire only 2 weeks after my meeting with MeantHFY, when the sensors along our outer rim detected something the Concord had never cataloged before. Not a fleet from a known species, not a warlord's raiding party testing our patience. Something else entirely, something that moved through the dark between systems in formations too precise to be anything but a deliberate, calculated force. We called them the Threshers, a name given by a frightened sensor technician on one of our outpost stations who watched them tear through automated defenses like a machine harvesting a field. Nobody on the Assembly knew where they came from. Some delegates argued they were a rogue construct, a leftover weapon from some ancient war that had finally woken after centuries of dormancy. Others believed they were a splinter empire from beyond the galactic rim, an extragalactic force that had simply never had a reason to notice us before. I did not care where they came from. I only cared about what they were doing, and what they were doing was winning. The first outposts fell within days. Not destroyed exactly, but silenced, their communications cut, their populations gone dark in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the silence humanity had left behind at the border years earlier. Except this silence carried none of the calm discipline I had witnessed at Ashgate Station. This silence felt like erasure. The assembly convened in emergency session, and for the first time in years, I watched delegates who had spent a decade congratulating themselves on efficient governance suddenly discover how little they actually understood about coordinated defense. Species that had grown accustomed to relying on humanity's aggressive response times found themselves debating jurisdiction and budget allocation, while entire star systems went dark one after another. I sat in the observation gallery during those sessions, watching MeantHFY try to hold together a coalition that kept fracturing along old species lines the moment real pressure was applied. The Ordun delegation blamed the Vicari for slow deployment. The Vicari blamed the outer colonies for inadequate defense spending. Everyone blamed everyone, and while they argued, the Threshers advanced steadily closer to the core worlds that housed Meridian Spire itself. Petra Solvin, the junior officer who once laughed at my concerns over the quiet border, found me in a corridor outside the Grand Hall during a recess in the emergency session. She did not laugh this time. She asked me plainly whether I thought the Concord could survive this without outside help, and I gave her the only honest answer I had. I told her the Concord had not faced a threat like this in living memory, because for as long as most delegates could remember, humanity had always absorbed threats like this before they grew large enough to matter. She asked the question everyone in that corridor was thinking but afraid to say aloud. She asked if anyone had considered reaching out to humanity for help. I told her the idea would need to survive the assembly floor first, and given how that body had treated humanity years earlier, I doubted many delegates would swallow their pride quickly enough to matter. I was wrong about the speed, though not about the pride. Within a week, as 3 more core systems fell silent, and a Thresher formation was detected only 2 jumps from Meridian Spire itself, the Assembly voted, in a session far less crowded and far less confident than the one that had exiled humanity years before, to send a formal request across the border asking for aid. Nobody wanted the assignment of carrying that request. The delegates who had voted loudest for exile years earlier suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, unwilling to be the ones who had to stand before a human representative and ask for help after having demanded, only years before, that humanity submit or leave. MeantHFY, to his credit, refused to hide from the consequences of his own vote. He insisted on going himself, and he insisted that I accompany him, since I was the only Concord official who had spent real time among humans since the Exodus began. We took a single unarmed vessel to the border marker, the same line I had watched the last human convoy cross years earlier. I remember the quiet tension on that ship, MeantHFY staring out at the dark beyond the marker as if trying to guess what waited on the other side. Neither of us knew what to expect. We had no functioning contact with human authorities, no diplomatic channel, nothing but the old frequency codes from before the exile, codes we did not even know still worked. They worked. Within an hour of broadcasting our request, a small human vessel appeared to escort us across the border, moving with a quiet confidence that reminded me instantly of Ashgate Station all those years ago. The pilot who greeted us over comms introduced herself simply as Grace Ellery, and her voice carried none of the anger or resentment I had expected from a species we had once tried to cage. What waited beyond the border stole the breath from my chest the moment our sensors adjusted to the scale of it. Human space had not merely survived exile. It had become something the old Concord maps could never have predicted. Shipyards stretched across entire moons, producing vessels in numbers that would have made even the old human fleets look modest by comparison. Colonies orbited stars the Concord had never bothered to survey, populated by generations who had grown up entirely outside our authority, never once asking permission for anything they built. Fleets moved with a discipline that felt less like a military and more like an ecosystem, self-sustaining, self-correcting, utterly comfortable with its own scale. Grace Ellery guided our ship toward a central command station, and along the way she answered questions I had carried with me for years without ever expecting an honest response. I asked her directly whether humanity had planned the exile before the Concord ever voted for it. She smiled in a way that was not unkind, and told me the Concord had simply given humanity the excuse it needed, at the exact moment humanity was finally ready to use it. She said her grandparents had spent their lives building toward this outcome, quietly, patiently, never provoking a conflict they knew they would eventually be blamed for starting, waiting instead for a moment when leaving would look, to the rest of the galaxy, like something done to humanity rather than something humanity chose for itself. I asked her why humanity had allowed the Concord to believe it held all the power in that vote. Her answer was simple, and it settled something in me that had been unresolved since the day I watched Daniel Whitfield accept exile without protest in the Grand Hall. She said humanity had learned, long before any of us met them, that the fastest way to win an argument with people who refuse to listen is to stop arguing entirely and simply become something they eventually have to ask for help from. Oren Vashta was silent through most of that exchange, and I could see the weight of it settling on him, the same weight I had carried since my first weeks watching the withdrawal at Ashgate Station. We had believed we forced a smaller, unruly species into submission. In truth, we had handed a patient, disciplined species the exact permission slip it needed to stop pretending to be smaller than it was. We reached the central command station an hour later, and I remember the moment the doors opened, because standing there to greet us was not a single ambassador speaking on behalf of a fractured species desperate for allies. Standing there was a coordinated council of human representatives, calm, organized, already briefed on the Thresher threat through channels I never learned the details of, already discussing response options before we had even finished explaining the crisis. A tall man introduced himself as General Edward Marlowe, and he did not waste time on ceremony. He asked precise questions about Thresher tactics, deployment patterns, weapon signatures, and casualty numbers, questions that made it clear humanity had been quietly tracking the Thresher incursion long before the Concord ever sent its formal request. I asked him, somewhat foolishly, how long humanity had known about the threat. He looked at me the way a teacher looks at a student who has finally asked the right question far too late in the lesson. He said humanity had detected the first Thresher signatures nearly 2 years earlier, at the very edge of surveyed space, long before the Concord's outdated sensor networks had any chance of noticing them at all. I asked him why humanity had not warned the Concord immediately, if they had known that long. His answer was not cruel, but it was honest in a way that stayed with me for the rest of that war. He said the Concord had made it very clear, years earlier, that it did not want humanity's involvement in matters beyond its own borders. He said humanity had simply respected that decision, right up until the Concord asked them to stop respecting it. Oren Vashta spoke then, quietly, admitting something I doubt he had ever planned to say aloud in front of a human delegation. He admitted that the vote to exile humanity had never truly been about safety or order. It had been about comfort, about a Concord assembly grown too used to relying on a species it refused to treat as an equal, and too proud to admit how much of its own stability depended on humanity's presence at the table. General Marlowe listened to that admission without any visible satisfaction, which somehow made the moment heavier rather than lighter. He simply said that humanity had not spent the last several years building fleets and colonies out of anger toward the Concord. They had spent those years building because it was, finally, entirely their own choice to do so, free of anyone else's approval. He agreed to bring the Thresher threat before the full Human Council, though he made no promises about what they would decide. As we were escorted toward temporary quarters to await that decision, I found myself standing beside a woman I had not been introduced to yet, older than most of the officers around her, watching the activity in the command station with quiet, careful eyes. She introduced herself simply as Alice Farron, a historian attached to the council for reasons I did not fully understand at the time. She asked me directly what I thought the Concord had learned from watching humanity leave all those years ago. I told her honestly that I was still learning it, even now, standing in the middle of a station built by a species the Concord had once dismissed as a temporary inconvenience to be managed and controlled. She nodded slowly and said something I would carry with me long after that war ended, something that finally gave shape to years of confusion I had carried since the day I watched the last human ship vanish beyond the border marker. She said the Concord had spent its entire history believing that power came from controlling others. Humanity, she said, had spent its history learning that real power came from no longer needing anyone else's permission to become exactly what it was always capable of becoming. I did not sleep that night, waiting in a station built by a species we once believed we had defeated, wondering whether the decision awaiting us in the morning would save the Concord, or simply confirm, once and for all, how thoroughly we had misunderstood what defeat had actually meant. The Human Council answered before the sun cycle on their command station had even completed its first full rotation, and their answer arrived not as a message, but as a fleet already moving. I woke to the sound of Grace Ellery knocking on the door of the quarters I had been given, her voice carrying an urgency that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with readiness. She told me the council had made its decision, and that Oren Vashta and I were expected on the command deck immediately if we wanted to understand what was about to happen. We arrived to find General Edward Marlowe standing before a display that stretched across an entire wall, star charts and fleet positions moving in real time as officers around him called out updates in calm, practiced voices. He did not turn to greet us with ceremony. He simply said that humanity would help, not because the Concord had asked nicely, and not out of any debt owed to an assembly that had once tried to cage them, but because the worlds under threat still held people humanity considered worth protecting, regardless of which government claimed authority over them. I asked him what conditions humanity intended to attach to that help. I expected a long list: reparations for the exile, permanent seats on the assembly, control over trade routes long denied to them. His answer surprised me more than anything else I had witnessed since crossing the border. He said humanity was not interested in conditions. He said humanity intended to fight this war on its own terms, using its own fleets, under its own command structure, and the Concord could either accept help freely given or continue managing the crisis alone. There would be no negotiation, because humanity no longer needed anything the Concord could offer in exchange. Oren Vashta, to his credit, did not argue. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when he finally understands that the balance of power in a room has shifted permanently, and there is nothing left to do but accept the new arrangement with whatever dignity remains available. What followed over the next several weeks reshaped everything I thought I understood about scale, about strategy, and about what a species could become when finally given the freedom to grow without asking anyone's permission first. Human fleets crossed the border in numbers that made the old Concord defense budgets look almost embarrassing by comparison. They did not simply reinforce the crumbling Concord lines. They restructured them entirely, moving with a coordination that made our own fractured coalition look, by comparison, like a crowd of strangers arguing over directions during an emergency. Ships that Pharaoh Idrisi had once described to me in vague, second-hand terms now moved past my own vessel in formations too precise to be anything but the product of decades of quiet preparation. I stood beside Grace Ellery on the observation deck of a human command ship during the first major engagement, watching Thresher formations that had shattered Concord defenses for weeks suddenly meet a force they had clearly never encountered before. The Threshers, whatever they were, whatever intelligence guided them, had grown accustomed to fighting an assembly that hesitated, that debated jurisdiction while colonies burned. They had never fought a species that decided, calculated, and acted within the same breath. I will not describe every detail of that engagement, because the details matter less than the shape of what happened. The Threshers, who had advanced steadily for weeks against a fractured Concord defense, were stopped within days once humanity took command of the response. Not through some overwhelming display of destructive power, but through discipline, through coordination, through a species that had spent generations learning how to organize itself without needing anyone else's approval to act decisively. Petra Solvin, who had been recalled to the command station as a liaison officer once the human fleets arrived, found me during a lull in the fighting and admitted something that I suspect many Concord officials were quietly realizing at the same time. She said watching the human fleets operate felt less like watching an ally arrive to help, and more like watching a much larger, much older sibling step in to correct a mess that had been allowed to grow far too large before anyone asked for help. I asked her if that realization bothered her. She thought about it for a long moment before answering honestly. She said it bothered her less than the realization that the Concord had spent years believing itself capable of managing the galaxy on its own, when in truth, its stability had always depended on a species it had chosen to push away rather than include. During one of the quieter stretches of the campaign, I finally had the chance to speak again with Alice Farron, the historian who had unsettled me so deeply on our first night at the command station. She showed me records the Human Council had allowed her to share, carefully selected fragments of the preparation that had gone into the Exodus years before I ever set foot on Ashgate Station. I learned that humanity had spent nearly 3 generations preparing for the possibility of exile, not because they wanted to leave the Concord out of resentment, but because they had recognized, long before the rest of us, that no relationship built on one side, constantly proving its worth to a council, unwilling to treat it as an equal, could last indefinitely. Rather than wait for that relationship to collapse into open conflict, they had chosen instead to prepare quietly for a peaceful departure, one that would look, to the rest of the galaxy, like something forced upon them rather than something they had patiently maneuvered the Concord into offering. Alice explained that the drills I had witnessed at Ashgate Station, the discipline, the calm efficiency, none of it had been improvised in the weeks after the exile vote. It had been rehearsed for decades, refined across generations, until an entire species could uproot itself and vanish beyond a border with the same calm precision as a well-trained crew responding to a routine drill. I asked her the question that had followed me since the Garden Module conversation with Oren Vashta years earlier. I asked her whether humanity had ever actually feared the Concord's threat of exile. She smiled, not unkindly, and told me that humanity had feared only one outcome throughout that entire process. Not exile, not conflict. They had feared that the Concord might, at the last possible moment, offer humanity genuine partnership instead of an ultimatum, because that offer would have forced humanity to choose between the freedom it had spent generations preparing to claim and a seat at a table that had never once treated it with real respect. The Concord, in the end, made the choice simple for them. By demanding submission instead of offering partnership, the Assembly had unknowingly granted humanity exactly what it had spent generations hoping to receive, an excuse to leave that carried none of the blame for choosing to go. As the campaign against the Threshers continued, I began to notice a shift within the Concord Assembly itself, transmitted back to me through updates from Meridian Spire. Delegates who had once celebrated humanity's departure as a triumph of order over chaos now spoke in far more careful tones, aware that every world saved from the Thresher advance was being saved by fleets belonging to a species the Assembly had tried, only years earlier, to control entirely. Oren Vashta, during a private conversation on the observation deck one evening, admitted to me that he no longer believed the Concord could return to its old arrangement, no matter how the war against the Threshers eventually ended. He said watching human fleets operate with such complete independence had convinced him that any future relationship between humanity and the Concord would need to be built on equal footing, or it would not be built at all. I told him I agreed, though I suspected the decision no longer belonged to the Concord alone. Humanity had already demonstrated, across every stage of the exile and everything that followed, that it no longer needed the Assembly's approval to determine its own future. Whatever relationship emerged from this war would exist because humanity chose to allow it, not because the Concord retained any power to demand it. As the final Thresher strongholds began to fall under the combined pressure of coordinated human and Concord forces, I found myself standing once more beside General Edward Marlowe, watching the last major engagement unfold across the display in the command station. He did not celebrate as the Thresher formations finally broke and scattered. He simply watched, calm and steady, the same quiet discipline I had witnessed in every human I had met since crossing that border. I asked him, finally, the question that had shaped my entire understanding of this conflict from the very beginning. I asked him whether humanity considered this war a victory. He turned to look at me, and for the first time since I had met him, something close to genuine emotion crossed his expression, though I could not fully name what it was. He said humanity did not measure victory the way the Concord measured it. He said victory, to humanity, had never been about defeating an enemy or proving superiority over a rival power. Victory, he said, had always simply meant being free to protect what mattered, on their own terms, without needing anyone else's permission to act. He told me that if the Concord wanted to understand what it had actually lost the day it voted to exile humanity, it would need to look past the fleets now clearing the last of the Thresher forces from Concord space, and consider instead everything humanity had quietly built during the years the Assembly assumed it was punishing them. I stood there in silence, watching the final Thresher signatures fade from the display, and I understood, finally and completely, that the war we had just survived was never truly the lesson the galaxy needed to learn. The lesson had been waiting patiently since the day Daniel Whitfield stood in the Grand Hall and accepted exile without protest, and it had simply taken this crisis to force the rest of us to finally see it clearly. The Thresher War ended not with a single dramatic battle, but with a slow, steady collapse of their remaining strongholds, one after another, until the last confirmed signature vanished from human and Concord sensors alike within the same season it had first appeared. I remember the final report reaching Meridian Spire, and I remember how strange it felt to watch an assembly that had spent years congratulating itself on stability now sit in stunned, grateful silence, aware of exactly whose fleets had saved it. In the weeks that followed, the Concord Assembly convened a special session, one unlike any I had witnessed during my years of service. Delegates who had voted for exile years earlier now debated, with far less confidence, what relationship the Concord should attempt to build with a species that had just demonstrated, beyond any argument, how thoroughly it no longer needed the Assembly's approval for anything. I was asked to present my findings to the full Assembly, a request I had never received in all my years as an observer. Oren Vashta insisted on it personally, telling the other delegates that if anyone in the Concord understood what had truly happened over the past several years, it was the officer who had spent that time watching humanity build an entire future the Assembly never noticed forming beneath its own comfortable assumptions. I stood in the same grand hall where I had once watched Daniel Whitfield accept exile without protest, and I told the Assembly everything I had learned. I told them about Ashgate Station, about the calm discipline of a population that had rehearsed its own departure for generations. I told them about Pharaoh Idrisi and the quiet growth of human territory that our own maps had never bothered to track. I told them about Grace Ellery, about General Edward Marlowe, about Alice Farron, and the patient decades of preparation that had shaped an entire species' response to a single vote the Concord had once believed it controlled completely. I told them, finally, the truth I had carried since that first night in the Garden Module with Oren Vashta. The Concord had never defeated humanity. The Concord had simply given humanity permission to stop pretending to be smaller than it was, at the exact moment humanity was ready to use that permission. The chamber was silent when I finished, the same silence I remembered from the day of the original vote, though this time the silence carried none of the confidence it once had. Oren Vashta rose after me, and for the first time in all my years serving under him, I watched him address the Assembly not as a confident chief speaker defending Concord authority, but as someone finally willing to admit how much that authority had always depended on a species the Assembly had refused to treat fairly. He proposed, formally, that the Concord send a delegation to human space, not to negotiate terms of submission or oversight, as it once had, but to request, humbly, the possibility of genuine partnership between equals. He reminded the assembly that humanity owed the Concord nothing, and that any relationship moving forward would exist only because humanity chose to allow it. The vote to send that delegation passed, though not unanimously, and not without bitter argument from delegates who still could not accept how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted. I did not care about their bitterness. I cared only about the delegation itself, and I was grateful, more than I expected to be, when Oren Vashta asked me to join him once again as we crossed the border for what I hoped would be the final time in my career. We were received this time not at a hastily assembled command station preparing for war, but at a proper capital, a world humanity called Meridian's End, chosen deliberately, Alice Farron told me later, because of how closely its name echoed the very station the Concord had built its own authority around for centuries. I understood immediately that the choice was not an accident. Humanity wanted us to understand, clearly and permanently, that whatever new relationship formed between our peoples would happen because they allowed it, on ground they had chosen, under terms they controlled. Daniel Whitfield greeted us personally at the Capitol, older now, though carrying the same calm patience I remembered from the Grand Hall years earlier. I had not expected to see him again, and I found myself unable to hide my surprise when he extended a hand toward Oren Vashta in a gesture that felt, remarkably, like genuine welcome rather than quiet triumph. He told us he did not intend to gloat over what had happened, and I believed him completely, because nothing in his manner suggested any desire for revenge or vindication. He said humanity had never wanted the Concord's downfall. They had only ever wanted the freedom to become whatever they were capable of becoming, without needing anyone else's permission to do so. Oren Vashta asked him directly what kind of relationship humanity was willing to accept moving forward. Daniel Whitfield's answer was simple, and it settled something in me that had remained unresolved since the very first day I watched him accept exile without protest. He said humanity would consider partnership, provided it was built entirely on equal standing, with no assumption from either side that one people held authority over the other. He said humanity had spent generations learning the cost of accepting anything less, and he made it clear, gently but firmly, that they would not accept anything less again. Oren Vashta agreed without hesitation, and I watched, in that quiet exchange, the beginning of something the Concord had never truly experienced in all its centuries of governing smaller, weaker species. For the first time, the assembly was entering a relationship not as the authority granting terms, but as an equal party negotiating them, humbled by a crisis it could not have survived alone. In the months that followed, I remained attached to the new diplomatic mission between the Concord and humanity, and I spent that time finally understanding the full shape of everything I had witnessed since the day of the original exile vote. I spoke again with Grace Ellery, now overseeing joint patrol coordination along the old border marker, which had been quietly redrawn to reflect a partnership rather than a boundary of exclusion. I spoke again with General Edward Marlowe, who told me plainly that humanity intended to remain fully independent in its own governance, regardless of how close the new partnership became, because independence, once earned, was never something they intended to trade away again for the comfort of belonging to a larger institution. I spoke, finally, at length with Alice Farron, who helped me understand the deeper truth behind everything I had witnessed. She told me that history rarely remembers moments of departure as anything other than defeat, because those watching from outside almost always assume that leaving means losing. She said the galaxy had made that same assumption the day humanity accepted exile without protest, and it had taken a war, and years of quiet growth hidden just beyond the edge of Concord maps, for anyone to understand how wrong that assumption truly was. She told me the real lesson of everything that happened was not that humanity had somehow defeated the Concord through cunning or deception. The lesson was simpler, and in many ways harder for an institution like the Assembly to accept. Humanity had never needed to defeat anyone. They had only needed the freedom to become what they already were, and the moment the Concord granted that freedom, believing it was punishing them, humanity had simply used it exactly as intended. I think often, even now, about the message painted on the hull of that final departing ship all those years ago, the 4 simple words that I once struggled to interpret as either threat or promise. We will remember this. I understand now that it was neither a threat nor a promise in the way I first believed. It was a statement of fact, delivered calmly by a species that had learned, long before the rest of us, that memory and patience were far more powerful tools than anger or revenge could ever be. The Concord Assembly, in the years since that war, has slowly rebuilt itself around a very different understanding of power than the one it held when I first began my service. Delegates no longer speak of controlling smaller species through oversight and submission. They speak, instead, carefully and with a humility that took a great deal of loss to earn, of partnership, of equal standing, of the danger in ever again assuming that another people's silence meant weakness rather than patience. I retired from active service not long after the new partnership was formally established, choosing instead to write down everything I had witnessed, from the quiet discipline of Ashgate Station to the final agreement signed on Meridian's end. I wrote it not as an official Concord record, but as a private account, because I believed, and still believe, that the truest lesson of those years would never survive translation into the careful, diplomatic language of assembly documents. The galaxy called it exile, the day the Concord voted to send humanity beyond its borders. I understand now, after everything I witnessed, that the galaxy was wrong to call it that from the very beginning. It was never exile. It was humanity simply choosing, on its own terms and in its own time, to stop asking permission to become exactly what it had always been capable of becoming. And in doing so, the galaxy did not watch humanity accept defeat that day in the Grand Hall. The galaxy watched, without understanding it at the time, an institution that had grown far too comfortable in its own authority, finally begin to learn what defeat actually meant, one quiet, patient year at a time.